Hello, hello. It is high noon on the East Coast, and we are super East Coast of the United States. I will clarify because we have participants joining from all over the world. I have seen from British Columbia to Morocco, Brazil, and my hometown of Philly. We are delighted to have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of you joining us today for our Big Questions Institute webinar on how to ungrade with our good friend, Jesse Stommel. I'm Homa Tavangar, and I'm joined by Will Richardson, my co-founder of the Big Questions Institute. We are just beyond delighted and thrilled to welcome you. It is not only a phenomenal session that we're going to have today, it's also our 1-year anniversary of the Big Questions Institute sort of 2.0. We started off as a sort of a humble little workshop that Will and I thought we should do together in November of 2019. And then when the pandemic hit, we realized that the themes that we cared about for educators were others cared about as well. And this is part of our now sort of lifelong learning process. And we are thrilled to see the response that educators from all over the world have had to the same questions, the big questions that have been top of mind for us as we have navigated through the pandemic. So welcome. And this, I'm also going to say before Will is going to introduce Jesse, this session today kicks off a very exciting series of Summer of Learning 2021 that we have put together. And we're going to tell you more about it at the end of the session. But this is the first session kicking off 5 workshops that are really about who are we going to be? How are we going to do it? How do we rethink schools and classrooms post-pandemic? Where do we go from here to truly serve our students in this changing world? So thank you so much to so many of you joining us.
And so many is the appropriate kind of phrase right here. We had over 1,500 people registered for this, which I think gives us all the sense that the ungrading topic is one that is on a lot of people's minds. As we all know, many things were surfaced about education over the course of the pandemic in the last 16 months and all the other things that have been happening in the world, obviously. And certainly a lot of people have been talking about what about grades? What do we do about assessments? Kids have already been stressed and anxious, and now even more so. Isn't this a good time to have a conversation about whether or not we want to rethink how we assess in the classroom? So basically, just want to let you know we're doing this session again. Jesse is kind enough to come back at 7 o'clock US Eastern tonight, so there's still time to tell your friends to go sign up. Basically, the link is there. And let me just take 1 minute to introduce Jesse, and then we'll get started. So he is the co-founder of the Digital Pedagogy Lab and Hybrid Pedagogy, the Journal of Critical Digital Pedagogy. He has a PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder. And he is co-author of a couple of books that I'm being very serious here, have influenced me a great deal in the way that I think about classroom teaching and the role of teachers, the value of teachers. And the great thing about them is that they are both free for download in PDF, or you can purchase them to support the work that he and his co-authors are doing. But the books are titled An Urgency of Teachers, the Work of Critical Digital Pedagogy, and Critical Digital Pedagogy, a Collection. And both of those, I think, are more relevant today than ever, considering the ways in which we've been required to shift into these online environments, which are really different from what the face-to-face environments of classrooms are all about. You can find him obviously at jessestommel.com, and you can follow him on Twitter at Jessifer. And with that, I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to turn it over to Jesse. Jesse, thanks so much for doing this. And we are totally looking forward to this session and for some other sessions you're going to do with us coming up, which we'll talk about later.
Thank you both so much. It's super great to be with you two today, and also to be with upwards of 1,500 people watching this. It's fascinating because if I think about this idea of ungrading and what the germ of it was, and the germ of it, what it was for me, it's a fascinating. It's a fascinating tale, I guess. I started ungrading 21 years ago. I did not call it ungrading at the time. And I actually went into my first teaching experience deciding from the very beginning that grades were, and I'll use this word again later, but it's the word that I can think of for this, anathema, to the work of education, that grades were somehow fundamentally at odds with the relationships that I wanted to build with students in my classroom. So 21 years, and I spent 11 of those years road warrior adjunct, teaching at 4 institutions, up to 9 classes per term. And some of those institutions had very strict rules about what grading looked like, how grading happened. And so for many, many years of my career, I was never secretive about my practices. I always was willing and excited to talk about pedagogy. It's sort of my hobby, my favorite thing to do. But I wasn't super open about my assessment practices, in part because I was nervous about how they would be received. But also, I think because there was a lot of years of my career where I thought of the work of teaching as something that I did in collaboration with students, and not something that I wanted the noise of the world, the noise of my administration, the noise of institutions to interfere with. And so I actually didn't talk publicly about my assessment practices until 2017. I wrote a blog post in 2017 called Why I Don't Grade. And it was the first time, aside from some conversations I'd had on Twitter and obviously open conversations that I had been a part of where I was very open about how I approach teaching, but it was the first time that I really wrote about my assessment practices. And in that blog post, I used the phrase ungrading, which is a term I'd used previously. And I remember, and Sean Michael Morris, a colleague of mine for many years, tells this story in a recent blog post of his, which I'll quote from in a bit. He tells the story about us sitting in England and me writing that blog post and me putting the word ungrading, I think 3 times in the final paragraph, and him telling me, whoa, you shouldn't use that word. He told me I shouldn't use the word because it's something that I've seen to be true, which is that the word sort of teeters at the edge of being a kind of zeitgeist. It teeters at the edge of becoming a thing, becoming trademark ungrading. And for Sean and I, who had been ungrading for 21 years, he started teaching right at the same time I did. This had been a conversation that we had had for our entire career. And also it's a conversation that has a long history. As long as there have been grades, there have been people pushing back productively on grades. And so the idea that this is something new, that this is something sort of zeitgeisty, was in some ways in conflict with what we knew to be true about this quote unquote movement, which actually has a 200+ year history. I nevertheless wanted to use the word. And the reason I wanted to use the word is because what I felt we needed at that moment, and what I feel like we need even more, is we need to catalyze a conversation. And the best way to catalyze that conversation is to give us something to talk about, to name the thing that we're talking about. And now I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes troubling the sort of edges of what this work means and what this work looks like. But I think it is useful for something to have a name. I'm going to share my screen now, and let me just give me a second to do that. And there we are. So that first post that I gave, that first post that I wrote in 2017 called "Why I Don't Grade" had a large cow as the photograph on the cover of that post, and the cow was tagged. And in my brain, I was thinking about the ways that not just the ways that certainly beef might be graded, which is obviously a reference that I'm pointing to, but also the ways that we tag everything in our world. We try and quantify everything. We try and turn cows into numbers, as this poor young guy is. And I think that we also turn students into numbers, and we turn teachers into numbers. We try and quantify what ultimately I feel like is incredibly subjective work. So I'm going to actually give you the thesis. This piece is called Ungrading and Introduction. I'm going to give you the thesis right out of the gate. And the thesis is this: ungrading means raising an eyebrow at grades as a systemic practice, distinct from simply not grading. The word is a present participle, an ongoing process, not a static set of practices. I really push back on the notion that there is a way to do ungrading, that I could, in this presentation, give you my top 10 list of how to do ungrading in your classroom. Because for me, teaching is deeply idiosyncratic. Each of us works with different students. Each of us works in different locations, in different geographies, with different politics. Each of us brings a different body to the work that we do in classrooms, and all of our students do as well. So our material circumstances affect the work that we can do together. So there aren't 10 things I can tell you to do tomorrow that will revolutionize your classroom. I will tell you, though, that for the first time ever, I feel charged to answer a question that I get so often, and that is, how do I start ungrading? So I will actually give you my top 4 ways to start ungrading at the end of this presentation. I want to start here with a quote from, actually, let me start with the quote. This is a quote from Sean Michael Morris from his recent blog post that I referenced. The piece, I love the title of this piece. It's called "When We Talk About Grades, We Are Talking About People." And I think that that's also an important pushback on the term ungrading, because the word ungrading centers grades. And I think one thing that we need to do in this work is realize that the problem with grades is the way that grades decenter people, the way that grades decenter human beings, the way that they decenter the humanity of our classrooms. Sean writes, deciding to ungrade has to come from somewhere, has to do more than ring a bell. It has to have pedagogical purpose and to be part of a larger picture of how and why we teach. Something that I've said in a recent blog post of mine is that we can't just change the way that we grade in our classes, that doing the work of ungrading requires that we rethink all of our pedagogical approaches. It requires us to rethink the kinds of relationships that we want to build with students. And often when I say that, people think, oh, wow, well, maybe I don't want to ungrade because that sounds entirely too complicated, like way too much work. And the thing is, teachers work incredibly hard. We're stressed. Not only is the work hard, but just teaching itself is a kind of emotional labor that, and especially at this moment right now, that feels incredibly taxing. And what I want to say is that I want to say that that work is ongoing. It's not that before you ungrade, you have to completely reimagine everything that you know about teaching. It's that stepping into a conversation about ungrading requires a willingness to reimagine who you are in a classroom, to rethink who your students are, to ask different questions of that, to ask different questions of yourself. So this is, when I lead workshops on grades and assessment, which I've been doing for many years, well before I was publicly on record as an ungrader, I start with foundational questions. And I think this is a place to begin. Who is assessment for? This, for me, is one of the most important questions that pushes at how our assessment structures work. Who is assessment for? How does this question force us to rethink how institutions structure their systems for evaluation? Is assessment for students? Is it for us as teachers? Is it for the institution? Is it for accrediting bodies? Is high school assessment there in order to show colleges the value of students? So is high school assessment for colleges? Is assessment in Bio 101 for the teacher of Bio 102? Ultimately, I think that the answer to that question for me is relatively easy. Assessment is and should be for students primarily. Doesn't mean there aren't also ancillary effects of assessment, or that we don't also assess for other reasons. But ultimately, I think if we answer that question, assessment is for and should be for students, it changes the way that we think about assessment. Some of these other questions, what's the difference between grading and feedback? It's something that I'll talk about a bit more, but it's also something that I think requires an entirely another webinar, which I'm happy to engage in that conversation. Why do we grade? How does it feel to be graded? And what would happen if we didn't grade? I think that one thing that often I hear from teachers when I talk about not grading, or I talk about ungrading, or I talk about raising our eyebrows at grades, one thing that I often hear from teachers is, I can't do that, I'm required to grade. And I think what we have to ask is, who's requiring us? How are they requiring? What exactly are they requiring us to do? How can we push back productively on that? How can we be creative? How can we, as teachers, take ownership of our own pedagogies? In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire argues against the banking model of education, an act of depositing in which the students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. In place of the banking model, Freire advocates for problem-posing education, in which a classroom or learning environment becomes a space for asking questions, a space of cognition, not information. He talks a good deal about dialogue, and he talks about the importance of dialogue in education. And he also writes about student-teachers and teachers-students, this way in which in classrooms we move back and forth between these roles of student and teacher, and that the fundamental work of education is that dialogue both within ourselves and between students and teachers. Peter Elbow, and I'm influenced a great deal by Peter Elbow, in part because he was one of the first pedagogues writing about grades and assessment that I read. So I started studying pedagogy in about 1999, and Peter Elbow, in Ranking, Evaluating, and Liking, Sorting Out Three Forms of Judgment, writes, assessment tends so much to drive and control teaching. Much of what we do in the classroom is determined by the assessment structures that we work under. He argues that our assessment structures determine how we work with students. Our assessment structures determine the kinds of relationships we create with them. Ultimately, he argues that we need to reverse this, that we need to decide the kinds of relationships that we want to build, the kinds of space we want to build in our classroom, and design assessment structures to conform to our pedagogical approaches. Ranking, metrics, norming, objectivity, uniformity, accreditation, measurement, rubrics, outcomes, quality, data, performance, averages, excellence, curves, inflation, mastery, standardization, rigor. These are some of the buzzwords that I hear increasingly around grades and assessment. And I think that the sort of ubiquity of these buzzwords and how much they seem to influence the work that we do, how much these words run the conversations that we have about teaching and learning. I think this is part of the reason why the conversation about ungrading has gotten to almost a fever pitch at this particular moment. There's several reasons, really. One of the things that I've seen over the 20 years that I've taught is I've seen a increasing quantification of the work that we do. I've seen students and teachers increasingly reduced to rows in a spreadsheet, their work increasingly reduced to columns in a spreadsheet. I've seen an expectation of quantifying the work that we do in our classroom. And not just that we have to quantify some of it to prove that something is happening, but increasingly that we can't do anything or don't feel like we can do anything unless it can be quantified. I think that the pushback on grades is part and parcel with the pushback on this quantification of the work that we do, of this, I guess I would say, over-objectification of the work that we do. I would argue grading by any of our conventional academic metrics undermines the work. Grades are not good incentive. Grades are not good feedback. Grades encourage competitiveness over collaboration. Grades are not good markers of learning. Grades don't reflect the idiosyncratic, subjective, emotional character of learning. And grades aren't fair. I would love to talk for 10 minutes about that word fair, because I think that that's a word that could easily appear on that previous slide. It's a word that I hear so often in conversations about grades. And I think that it is a troubling word for me, especially because of the ways that I think the word fair attempts to flatten difference. It attempts to flatten difference between students, between teachers, and flatten difference between our disciplines, between our institutions, between the locations in which we're doing this work. Ultimately, I think FAIR has an expectation that all students will be assessed in the same ways, at the same times, for the same reasons, and that the same objects will be assessed. And yet that, in my brain, doesn't recognize the extraordinarily dynamic work that happens in classrooms, the dynamic work that teachers do in classrooms, the dynamic selves they bring to that space, and the dynamic selves that students bring to that space. This is the thesis, I think, of this. It's probably the thesis of every talk that I give. Start by trusting students. This was an exercise that I did 4 years ago, where I asked people to write their hashtag forward pedagogies. And this was my hashtag forward pedagogy. And it stuck with me since that date. But there's something that I would add to this, and it's something that I have kind of hinted at already. And that's that there's a corollary to this, and that the corollary is start by trusting teachers. And I think ultimately the work of ungrading forces this conversation about the ways in which our institutions don't trust teachers, our systems don't trust teachers, our governments don't trust teachers. And it also pushes on a narrative that I've seen over the last 20 years that has demeaned the work of teaching. And part of this is part and parcel with the mass defunding of education in so many of our educational systems around the world, especially in the US, watching just the funding for education be utterly decimated. Conventional grading is often at odds with our institutional missions. So far, I haven't seen a school mission statement with any of these. And I've actually used this slide in several presentations, and I'm just waiting for someone to tell me, no, in fact, this is in our institutional mission. But I don't think it's possible. I've looked at enough institutional missions, K through 12, college, non-traditional, to know that with pretty good certainty that these don't appear in any of these mission statements. We pit students and teachers against one another. We rank students in competitive ways. We measure output with little concern for the learning process. We value extrinsic over intrinsic motivation. We start from a deep place. We start from a place of deep suspicion of students. We assess in ways that reinforce bias against marginalized student. And these are not just cheeky things that I say about grades. These are not just manifesto-like statements. All of these point to data and research that supports a notion, for example, that intrinsic motivation is better for learning than extrinsic motivation, or the incredible bias that's inherent in grades. I want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk about bias in grading, but I want to start even earlier and talk about the way that bias plays out across our educational systems. This data here is from a piece by Soraya Shimali called "All Teachers Should Be Trained to Overcome Their Hidden Biases." It was in Time magazine. It's a very short piece. She actually links to all of the studies from which she's drawing this data. Super useful to go back and read all of these original studies. Some of them are actually more gut-wrenching than the data that I'm sharing here. Black girls are 12 times more likely than their white counterparts to be suspended. While Black children make up less than 20% of preschoolers, they make up more than half of out-of-school suspensions. Teachers spend up to 2/3 of their time talking to male students. They also are more likely to interrupt girls. When teachers ask questions, they direct their gaze towards boys more often, especially when questions are open-ended. So when we're thinking about the complex selves that students bring to our classrooms, when we think about the ways that our students' material circumstances affect the learning that happens in our classrooms, we have to think not only about their present material circumstances, but also their educational experiences throughout their lives and how those educational experiences are changing the interactions that we have with them in our classrooms. This data here is all from K through 12 education, but many of these studies have also, like the third one here, teachers spending up to 2/3 of their time talking to male students, have been duplicated at the college level. Interestingly, with this study and its corollary in university education, teachers spend up to 2/3 of their time talking to male students, and that's not only male teachers, it's also female teachers shown to be more likely to talk to male students, to make eye contact with male students, to ask open-ended questions of male students. So when we get to the point of assessing students and believing that our assessment of them can or will be objective, we have to ask ourselves, how many different variables are influencing the work that we do with students? How many different variables are influencing what each of our students brings to the learning experience in our classrooms? This is a meta-analysis about bias in grading. The results suggest that bias can occur in subjective grading when graders are aware of irrelevant information about the students. This meta-analysis includes data from 20 studies of 1,935 graders. The authors ultimately suggest blind grading, but I'd argue race, gender, and ability do not constitute irrelevant information. We can't counter bias by ignoring it. Who our students are is exactly relevant, and their specific challenges need to be accounted for in our approach to assessment. So blind grading, meaning the practice of grading your students purportedly without knowing who they are, or without knowing what this study calls irrelevant information about them. And I point specifically to race, gender, and ability because those are three of the variables that this study looked at particularly. Instead of blind grading, what I would argue is that all of those factors that determine who students are in our classroom, are absolutely relevant information. And that when we design assessment, we need to design assessment not to make those differences invisible, but to account for those differences and to account for how those differences influence the work that our students do. When you look at that data and think about blind grading, and then you go back to this slide and you think about what kind of assessment strategy do I create for a Black girl who was suspended from preschool? When she gets to my college course, how has her educational experience, her educational history been influenced by that moment? And how do I account for that moment in my assessment practices? This idea that when we assess students, what are we actually assessing? If it can't be objective, which I would argue, if it is in fact deeply subjective, when we assess students, when we have high stakes testing, what in fact are we finding out about students? This is data from Sharma and Carr, Food Insecurity and Standardized Test Scores. Food insecurity is a significant factor in determining the average math SAT score. An increase in food insecurity lowers the student's math SAT score. So what we're actually finding out about students is not their aptitude in math or how much we've taught them about math, but in fact, what we're finding out is their likelihood of being or having been recently food insecure. Osterk et al. Found further that students perform more poorly on exams when they are several weeks removed from receiving food stamps benefits. So it's not just whether or not they're food insecure, but it's how recently they've received support that determines their performance on these high stakes standardized exams. Children displayed a statistically significant increase in cortisol level in anticipation of high stakes testing. Large decreases and large increases in cortisol were associated with underperformance on the high stakes test. So large increases in cortisol would be associated with stress, with acute anxiety. Interestingly, this also points to the fact that low cortisol levels also lead to lower performance on high stakes tests. Lower cortisol levels would be associated with trauma, with disassociating because of acute trauma. And so ultimately, if we think about this present moment of the pandemic and we think how many of our students are feeling stressed, anxious, or who have experienced acute trauma, and then we think about our ability to adequately assess their aptitude, their performance, their learning, I think this data pushes against our ability to do that successfully. Grades are anathema to the presumption of the humanity of students. There's that word anathema again. Support for their basic needs and engaging them as full participants in their own education. Invigilated exams won't ensure integrity. Plagiarism detection won't unseat online paper mills. Incessant surveillance won't help us listen better for the voices of students asking for help. Historically, grades are more of an anomaly than anything else. They are a very recent technology. Often when I talk about grades and I ask people, why do we grade? The answer I get back is, well, it's just what we do, or it's what we've always done. It's just the normal way of doing things. And yet, I think it's important for us to think about what the history of this is. And also, I think to think of it as a technology that influences the kinds of work that we do as students. Prior to the late 1700s, performance and feedback systems in education were incredibly idiosyncratic. The first official record of a grading system was from Yale in 1785. Throughout the 19th century, they became increasingly comparative, numerical, and standardized. The A to F system appears to have emerged in 1898, with the E not disappearing until the 1930s. And the 100-point or percentage scale became common in the early 1900s. Letter grades were not widely used until the 1940s. Even by 1971, only 67% of primary and secondary schools in the US were using letter grades. So the idea that we grade because it's just the way that we've always done it. In fact, grades have a 200-year history. They've only been popularized. This data here is from the US. They've only been popularized in the US in the last 60 years. And across our systems, grades are, as I said, a relatively recent phenomenon. An objective system for grading was created so systematized schooling could scale, and we've designed technological tools in the 20th and 21st century that have allowed us to scale further toward standardization and away from subjectivity and care. The grade takes the complexity of human interaction within a learning environment and makes it machine readable. A/A minus, A/B plus, F plus. I don't think anyone actually gives F pluses. 97%, 59%, 18 out of 20, 10 out of 20, high first, low 2-1. I often ask a question when I lead a workshop on grade, when I ask someone, what's the weirdest grade you got? Or what grade do you remember the most clearly? The grade I remember most clearly was an A minus minus. And it's the grade that I, to this day, am haunted by. I'm haunted by this A minus minus. It actually feels cruel to me. Like I would say the A minus minus was the worst grade I ever got. And the reason it is because that second minus feels like a personal attack somehow, or it feels like an attack on who I am as a thinker, a scholar, a worker, a student. Because why? What else was that second minus communicating? And I think this is one of the problems of grades, is that because they don't communicate clearly, because they don't tend to communicate objectively, we end up having an emotional reaction to them more than almost anything else. Research shows 3 reliable effects when students are graded. They tend to think less deeply, avoid taking risk, and lose interest in learning itself. Ungrading starts with teachers just talking to students about grades. Demystifying grades and the culture around them gives students a sense of ownership over their own education. This ultimately is what I care about. I don't necessarily care about grades or not grades. I care about this. I care about students being authors of their own learning. And I also feel like it's important for teachers to be authors of their own teaching, which means, again, taking ownership, taking agency and having systems and institutions that don't obstruct that agency or ownership. Taking grades at least partly off the table means I have a whole different set of conversations with students I work with. My goal isn't to create a learning environment entirely free of grades. My students still get graded in other classes, but to create a safe space for students to ask critical questions about grades, about how school works, and about their own learning. So I'm going to end with two slides here, one that gives a brief overview of a couple different alternative forms of assessment. And then I'm going to end with my promised 4 things you can do tomorrow in your classroom to start ungrading. So minimal grading. This is an idea from Peter Elbow. He talks about using scales with fewer gradations to make grading simpler, fairer, clearer. He talks about the arbitrariness of something like a 97.3%. What is the difference between someone who gets a 97.3 and someone who gets a 95.5? Ultimately, he argues that the only clear difference is that the person who got the 97.3 did better than the person who got the 95.5. So he argues that these complicated grading systems that we so often use, ultimately are better at ranking students than they are at evaluating students clearly or offering them feedback that's useful to them. Contract grading. Grading contracts convey expectations about what is required for each potential grade. Students work toward the grade they want to achieve, and goalposts don't unexpectedly shift. I think this idea of shifting goalposts is important to point out. We can't just take grades off the table without having a deeper critical conversation, because ultimately removing visible goalposts and replacing them with invisible goalposts ends up doing even more harm to our struggling students, to our most marginalized students. What we have to do is raise our eyebrows at the goalposts altogether, not just imagine that we can remove them from the table and sort of obliterate bias without having a critical conversation about that bias. Authentic assessment. Having students write for real-world audiences, focusing on intrinsic motivation and drawing students into the design of assignments, assessments. One of the activities that I have done with students several times in writing courses is having them put on a film festival. And they have to do all of the writing that comes with writing a film, making a film, writing a DVD dust jacket, designing a poster, writing the copy for a poster, writing invitations, trying to get sponsors, writing business emails to get those sponsors. And then at the end of this activity, they have a real world experience that they've created, and they get feedback from the audience. And so they're not just turning work into me, but actually engaging with a real world audience. And finally, and this is the one that I have done most throughout my career, process letters, asking students to reflect on their work and offer feedback on those reflections. Students help guide the grading of their own work, asking students to self-reflect, to self-evaluate, to self-grade. And now my promised small things you can do tomorrow to start the work of ungrading. Number 1, change how you talk about assessment. Ungrading works best as part of a holistic pedagogical practice. Use words like ask or invite rather than submit or required. Ask students about their expectations for their work rather than centering yours. One of the things when I think back to what Paulo Freire writes about transactional education, and then I look at how we describe our courses, how we write course plans, how we write course syllabi, how we write lesson plans, how we write assignment instructions. So much of the language that we use is transactional. And so even just taking one assignment description that you have and reading it really carefully and asking yourself, am I creating a transactional relationship from my students where they become a depository and I just become the receptacle for their learning? Am I imagining that something is happening in my brain and I'm going to take it out of my brain and put it into students' brains, and then they are going to reflect that back to me in some sort of assessment? And how can I trouble that? How can I make education less transactional? Number 2, invite students to a conversation about grades. Ask students how being graded makes them feel, how it affects their motivation. As a group, read and discuss a piece like Alfie Cohen's The Case Against Grades. So one thing that I've seen be extraordinarily effective is just bringing students into a critical conversation about how grading works, what grades mean, and ultimately, this not only helps them in our course, but it helps them become critical readers of all of their courses. It helps them think in a more active way about their education. So again, if you change nothing else, taking one class session, have students read a piece like Alfie Cohen's The Case Against Grades and have a conversation about it. So even grades feel like something students can take ownership of. Number 3, grade less stuff, grade less often, grade more simply. Create space in your course for discovery and experimentation. Use a grading scale that feels less arbitrary and communicates more clearly to students. Ask students to do work that you don't collect. Peter Elbow, when he's writing about minimal grading, offers an alternative to a 100-point scale. Or in one course that I had, there was a 1,000-point scale. And I really couldn't get my brain around what the difference between someone who had 973 points and someone who had 989 points, what that difference would signify or what it would mean. Ultimately, it becomes just a collecting of points. He argues, when he's talking about minimal grading, for using smaller scales, 3-point scales, even 2-point scales, 1-point scale. A 3-point scale might be submitted, excellent, needs improvement. A 2-point scale might be submitted, needs improvement, or needs revision. A 1-point scale might be they did it or they didn't do it. And he also writes about, and this I feel like is one of the most effective practices I've used in my own teaching. He writes about a 0-point scale. A 0-point scale is you ask students to do work, and then you make them provide no evidence of having done that work. Ultimately, I think if we want to encourage intrinsic motivation, we can't be the receiver of everything that students do. We can't be the external approval for everything that they do. And finally, ask students to reflect on their own learning. Even if you change nothing else about how you grade, ask students when and how they learn, ask what barriers they face, listen, and believe the answers. Thanks. I'm excited about these questions. I've seen the questions flowing in on YouTube, but there have been so many that I couldn't possibly keep up with them. So I'm excited for a few of those to get shared and for us to talk about them.
Well, first of all, thanks so much, Jesse. That was amazing. Really, really informative. I'm still trying to get that 0-point scale idea like baked in my head, because it's so true, right? We just want kids to hand in everything just for proof of the fact that they did it. But I think you're absolutely right. That's just one idea out of many that really is resonating right now.
Also, the other thing I would say about that is that when we're often worried about our own labor. Teaching takes a lot of time. And ultimately, how do you save time? Well, don't feel like you have to be the judge and jury of every single thing that students do. That saves us ultimately a lot of time that we can spend having those robust, genuine, authentic relationships.
Right. Homa, do you want to pull one out?
Yeah. I just want to say, like, just kind of how blown away I am by all of this, Jesse. And it is definitely reflected. I feel like the energy that's in the chat from over 500 people who are participating, and it is truly a chat waterfall. And this is not my area that I focus on. So for me, this is very fresh content, what you are sharing. It's not something I've spent the last few decades thinking about as much. I'm sort of in a different place most of the time. So I have to say how I just want to share sort of a little meta before I go into the question. I am actually like feeling emotional about this, and I would never have thought that a conversation on grading and assessment would like get my heart racing and feeling emotional. But this idea of going from transactional to relational is so powerful, that we are ultimately, and so this is actually exactly what I work on. So we're really talking about relationships. We're talking about trust. We're talking about justice. We're talking about systemic transformation. I didn't think that's what this conversation was really. I mean, maybe later getting to know you and your work, I did, but it isn't how I think about this topic. And to me, that is incredibly powerful. So I just want to first thank you. And it is really also an example of, something we think about a lot at the Big Questions Institute is how we're moving away from the industrial model to a contextual model of understanding the world and context. So ultimately it is about justice and trust and systems change. So there's all that. There is, okay, so now to get to some, and I don't know if you want to comment on that, but.
Yeah, actually, I do have, but my comment, I think, is that I guess I am also a reluctant researcher on grades and assessment. And the reason I say that is because it isn't what I planned to do with my life. It isn't what I imagined my focus would be. And yet the reason I think it is because every conversation that I've been in about equity, about accessibility, about relational pedagogies, ultimately grades always end up being the elephant in the room of those conversations. And I decided if I want to have those conversations, I've got to look at that elephant. And I've got to either get that elephant out of the room, make friends with the elephant, or get the elephant helping do that other work, because currently it's not. Sorry for that long elephant.
No, it's perfect. So, and it's interesting, the irony, before we went live on the webinar, you anticipated that someone would ask a question along the lines of, well, I want my doctor to get good grades. I want to make sure that they're good, good doctors and good physicians. And so what about that? And, it is interesting that when you think about the healing profession and the profession that is about justice, the legal system, lawyers, right? The irony of, so we have a question that asks, without grades, what would happen to career paths like doctors and lawyers, healing and justice, where the whole system of grades, one issue, it's used to weed out students.
Yeah.
And then there was a little bit of a back and forth in the chat. Then there was a response. Why do we need to weed those students out? Some may just take a little longer to master and make better doctors for that. And then reply, I agree. The pushback is, that's what I get from students and parents. So the whole system depends on that. Grades equal success, and it is all about weeding people out, and your GPA shows your capacity or not. So I know you get asked that all the time.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about, I have kind of a stock answer for it, but really I'm asking myself to rethink why that question gets asked so often. And I think it's because it feels so precarious and important to people. I think at the heart of that question is, there are people doing life or death work. And how do we make sure that people don't die, or that people are not abused, that people are not done harm? And that's so important. And so at the heart of that question, I think, is a really important anxiety. So I don't want to demean anyone for asking that question, but it is true that I get that question all the time. And my answer is usually, when I'm on the table and I have had a chronic illness, and I have had open abdominal surgery, and this is a bit TMI, but I had chronic appendicitis. They had no idea what it was. Bile was leaking into my body over the course of 9 months. They couldn't diagnose it. And ultimately they did exploratory surgery thinking it might be a hernia. It was supposed to be in and out patient surgery. And they started cutting and didn't find a hernia, and just kept cutting deeper and deeper, and then found that my appendix had burst and then fused to my abdominal wall, which was holding it together. And ultimately, my answer to that question is that I want my doctor, and the cheeky part of this answer is that I want my doctor not to have memorized all the terminology, but to have read all of the books of Virginia Woolf or Toni Morrison. Because at that critical moment, I want them to have the critical thinking capacity that they need to respond to a situation that they've never seen before. And I want them to be able to save my life. And it isn't the memorizing of the body parts that's going to help them do that. It is those critical thinking faculties. And so if our assessments can adequately assess the ability of a doctor to anticipate and respond to a situation that nobody could have expected, that doctor couldn't have anticipated, then I want the assessment structure that does that. And I don't think it's traditional grades that prepare that person to do that work. And ultimately, I don't want assessment structures that eliminate, because of bias, a diverse set of doctors and lawyers from those professions. Because at the critical moment, when a Black person is on that operating table, I want someone who sees and understands that person in a way that they can save their life. There's lots of data that show that Black patients are more likely to die on an operating table. And because there's bias baked into our systems. So I guess that's my answer, is that these are life or death things. And so then we really need to think in thoughtful, complex ways about our assessment structures. My other answer to that is that I always wonder why it's just lawyers and doctors that are brought up in that example, because there are so many life or death professions. And I think what we need to do is be questioning why we only look to those as life or death professions when there are obviously so many more.
Yeah, and somebody brought up that pilots are not great. They don't get letter grades in their training. That's a life or death situation. You have to know how to fly the plane.
Yeah.
But you're not getting a grade in pilot school. I don't know about that, but
honestly, teaching is life or death work.
Sure.
My dad was a treatment administrator in prison systems. His work was life or death work. He built and sort of innovated therapeutic communities for rehabilitation within prison systems. That's life or death work. And it's also extraordinarily complicated subjective work that he couldn't really be trained through standardized tests.
So I'm going to jump in. I want to be respectful of people's time, because we said this was going to be 45 minutes. I think we could go for at least 3 or 4 hours here. But so here's the little bit of a reveal. We've been sharing this out in the reminders as well. But Jesse will be back in about a week and a half to do 4 hours on ungrading. And we're thrilled again that he's willing to kind of collaborate with us on this. And Jesse, I don't know if you want to maybe talk just really briefly about some of the topics in the workshop and what maybe a little bit more depth into where you're going to go. But we just want you to know that if you register for that before Tuesday midnight, we'd be happy to give you 20% off. The coupon code is Ungrade20, and you can use that when you sign up. And also to remind you that if you have teams of more than 5 people, just feel free to email us, and we will be happy to give you a little bit of a discount as well on that. But Jesse, maybe just a minute or so on what you're planning for those 2 days?
I mean, ultimately, I think that this conversation also needs to be a dialogue. So a space for a smaller group of people to talk about their specific challenges, their specific successes, because I can give my 4 things you can do tomorrow, but ultimately I can only do that successfully if I'm in conversation with other teachers. And if we're kind of coming up with and strategizing that work together. There will be some presentational aspects going further into the history. I want to talk more about feedback and about the complexity of feedback, because often people say, oh gosh, well, if I don't grade, I'll have to do so much more feedback, and that's so much more labor. I want to push back on that a little bit and have a more nuanced conversation about what kind of feedback we want to give to our students, what kind of feedback is useful. If grades are not successful at giving students feedback, then how do we actually give students feedback about their work? I also want to talk more about teacher agency and talking about the role of teachers in guiding the assessment practices that we use in our classes.
Awesome. And Homa, I can't get into the YouTube to do it right now, into the chat, but maybe you could put the address, the correct address. Unfortunately, it's ungrading-workshop instead of just big questions /ungrading, but you can see the whole thing. You can get more information on that on our site. Maybe if I go through this really fast, Jesse, you can take one more question here at the end, but we just want to also talk a little bit more of the Summer of Learning. Jesse's is the first of 5 workshops that we're doing. His is on how to ungrade. Home and I will be doing Fearless Inquiry. Pam Moran and Ira Sokol will be doing Timeless Learning. Gary Steger and Sylvia Martinez will be doing PBL Like You Mean It, and Jacinta Williams and Shelley Paul will be doing Equity by Design in September. You can get all that information. And again, we really think this is a series of workshops that will get us thinking differently about this kind of post-pandemic moment that hopefully we're moving into here. I know that the world is still on fire in a lot of different places, and even the idea of thinking about post-pandemic seems a little bit early, but to plant some seeds and thinking about, hopefully when we get through this, maybe some different ways of thinking about doing our work. And just so you know too, if you register for this whole series, you get 20% off what would be the total cost of all 5 of those. So I'm going to ask one other question here at the end, just really fast, because I actually, when I was still in the classroom back in the late 20th century, I was actually doing some ungrading in my writers' workshops. Peter Elbow was a big influence on that, obviously Nancy Atwell and others. And it was a real struggle, not so much with the kids, but with the parents and my supervisor and other teachers who were like, what are you doing? And so just quickly, I mean, how do you, it feels like if we do this, we have to go through a period of detox almost, right? that, you know what I'm saying? That grades have become such an ingrained part of the expectation of the narrative and all of that. Any ideas on how to help people build that kind of capacity for detox? Because they're going to be shaking a lot when we ask them to do this. They're going to be like very nervous about it. Any thoughts on that real fast?
Yeah, there was another question in the chat that I think this connects with, and I'm just going to read the question. It says, how do you begin to ungrade or grade less in high schools where teachers are responsible for giving credit, reporting percentage marks, et cetera? And in that word responsible to their institutions, responsible to parents, even a conversation about how they're potentially responsible to future employers of students. Ultimately, I think one of the things that we need to do is go back to like why I was a reluctant theorist and researcher on ungrading in the first place, which is that to some degree, we have to think of our first responsibility as being to our students. And that means letting some of that noise go. And that's super hard because there is so much noise, even just that laundry list of buzzwords. We hear those in our heads, even when we're not hearing them from institutions, administrators, parents. So I think letting go is important. The other answer that I have to this question is, how do you begin when there are all these requirements, when there are all of these expectations? And to me, I think the key is that we have to bring students in as partners. So if we are expected to do X, then we ask students to work with us toward doing X. If we have to give them a grade at the end of the term, we bring students in as partners in helping determine what that grade will be. If we have to talk to parents, administrators, we bring students in as partners, talking to their parents, talking to administrations, because ultimately I think that students are the ones who will push the needle on this, not us.
Absolutely agree. Thanks so much for that. So I'll just say thank you sincerely for allowing us to collaborate with you on this hour. It was really, really very kind of, well, certainly interesting and just kind of mind expanding to think about this. And I know that other people in the who were watching it feel the same way. Thanks, Jesse. Appreciate it. And Homa, I'll let you have the last word on this.
Well, I just super grateful to think about this topic from transactional to relational. And so for us, the relationship with all of you in this community that we're growing is really important. We have some requests for more info. We're going to try to post some more info on the YouTube chat with our email addresses. And you know what, you can just go to bigquestions.institute and you can email us from that. Will and I personally look at everything that comes in, and we are absolutely delighted to hear from so many of you. And then Jesse will be back at 7 p.m. Eastern. That's 7 a.m. in Shanghai and Singapore and wherever you're coming from in the world. So if you want another live session, and this video will be up on our YouTube channel as well. So we're not going away. We're just building up. So Jesse, thank you. Truly, thank you so much again. And thanks everybody for joining us.
Cheers, everyone. Stay well. We'll see you later.
See you.
Bye.
Awesome.